We continue now at the top of Daf Samech Vavam and Beis in Meseches Gitin. This is Gittin Daf 66b. The Mishnah continues, Ola Shlosha Kisvu Utenu Get Lishti, or let's say a person tells three people, write a get and give it to my wife. And Rashi explains, Ola Shlosha Kisvu Utenu Get Lishti, Afal Pishain Ru'uyin Layasos Bezdin. The point of the Mishnah over here is, even though three people are in theory fit to be a Bezdin, Kevan de Behedya Amar Lahu Kisvu, since he explicitly said to them to write, Lo Bezdin Shavinu Elo Edim, it's clear that he's not appointing them as a Bezdin, rather he's appointing them as witnesses. And so that's why the Mishnah continues and says, again, if he says, Kisvu get it tenu leishti, hare elu yichtavu v'yitnu, so they have to write it and they have to give it. Now in contrast, the Mishnah says, Amar l'shlosha, let's say he says to three people, and again specifically three people, not two people like we saw in the previous summit at the beginning of the Mishnah. If he says to three people, tenu get leishti, give a get to my wife, and he doesn't say kisvu, he doesn't say write it, hare elu yomru la'acherim v'yichtavu, so then they can actually instruct others, they can tell others to write the get, mivnei sha'asa in bezdin, because he's essentially designated them as a bezdin, so they now have that authority. Divrei Rabbi Meir, that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. V'zu halacha hela Rabbi Chanina ishonu mi beis ha'isurin. Now this halacha was brought up from Rabbi Chanina ishonu from the prison, and Rashi will explain. Mekubal ani ba'omer l'shlosha tenu get l'ishti. There's a tradition that I have that when someone says to three people, give a get to my wife, sheyomru la'acherim v'yichtavu mivnei sha'asan bezdin, that they're allowed to tell others to write it because the person has designated them as a bezdin. Amar Rabbi Yossi, so Rabbi Yossi says, responding to that, no minu l'shliach, we said to this messenger, af anu mekubal, and we also have a tradition, she'afilu amar lebezdin hagadol sheb'Yerushalayim, that even if he says to the great court in Yerushalayim, tenu get l'ishti, give a get to my wife, sheyilmedu v'yichtavu v'yinu, that they have to learn, and they have to write, and they give the get, meaning they have to do it themselves, they cannot appoint others. Essentially, Rabbi Yossi responded, we have the opposite tradition. And the Mishnah continues, Amar le asara kisvu tenu get leishti, if he says to 10 people, write and give a get to my wife, echad kosev v'shnayim chosman, one of them writes the get, and 2 people sign the get. Kulchem kesovu, but if he uses the word kulchem, if he says, all of you write the get, echad kosev, one of them writes the get, v'kulam chosman, and they all sign the get, lefikach, and therefore, in meis echad mehen, if one of them were to die, hareza get batel, it would be a get that is nullified, it would not be a kosher get. And Rashi explains, Amar l'shlosha tenu v'lo amar kisvu. Again, if he says to 3 people and he uses the word tenu, give the get to my wife, but he doesn't say kisvu, he doesn't say to write the get, hare elu yomru la'edim acherim, so they can say to other edim, lichtov, to write, v'lachsom, v'litein, and to sign and to give, mimnei sha'asa in bezdin, because he's designated them as a bezdin. Meibeso asurin, and then Rabbi Chanina ishonu, he brought up a tradition from the prison. What does that mean? Says Rashi, mishmo shel Rabbi Akiva. This is a tradition in the name of Rabbi Akiva, shenechbash beibeso asurin, because Rabbi Akiva was imprisoned. No minu l'shliach, and then the response was, Rabbi Yossi said, amarnu l'shliach, we said to the shliach l'chanina, meaning to this Rabbi Chanina ishonu, we said to him, shenasa shliach ba'alacha zu, he was a messenger in terms of this halacha, la'omra bebeis hamedrash, to say this halacha over in the beis medrash. So Rabbi Yossi essentially responded that even by the Bezdin Hagadol Sheb'Yerushalayim, that is not the tradition. Rather, Yilmedu, they have to learn. Imeinam Yodin Lichtov, if they don't know how to write, Yilmedu Lichtov, they should learn how to write the get. Achiechtavu Ba'atzman. The point is, they themselves have to write it. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says, Sholchu lei mibei Rav l'Shmuel, they sent from the yeshiva of Rav to Shmuel, Yilamdeinu Rabbeinu, teach us our Rebbe, Amar l'Shnayim kisvu tenu get l'ishti, if somebody says to 2 people who write, and give a get to my wife, v'yamru l'sofer v'chasav v'chasmu hein, and then they say, they tell the scribe, and he writes it, and then they sign, Mahu, what's the halacha in such a situation? And Rashi explains, Hachi Garcinon, here's the proper text, Amr l'shnayim kisvu tenu get lishti, if he says to 2 people, write and give a get to my wife, v'yamru l'sofer v'chasav, and they tell a sofer to write it, v'chasmu hein, but they do the signing, Mao, what's the halacha? Hadakatani masnisan l'kasvu lichtavu be'atzman achasimakoi. That which it says in the Mishnah that they themselves have to write the get, is that going just on the chasim and the signing? V'hacharei chasmu hein, and here they did sign. The fact that they asked a scribe to write it is not a problem. Odil machsav get koy, or maybe it's going on the actual writing of the get, and therefore this would be a problem to have a sofer write the get. And the Gemara continues, Shalach lahu, he sent back to them the answer to the question. Teitze, she has to be divorced, meaning if she relied on such a divorce to marry a second husband, that second marriage is not good. We force her to divorce from the second husband. V'hadavar tzarech Talmud, but we need to look into the matter. And Rashi explains, Shalach luhu teitzeh, she has to be divorced. Im nisis beget zeh, if she gets married with this get, teitzeh misafik, she has to divorce that second husband because there's a doubt over here. To misafkalani kosher, although we have a doubt whether it's kosher or not. V'hadavar tzarech Talmud, and this needs to be looked into. Kilomer ein hadavar hazeh barer lanu, meaning to say it's not clear to us. We need to learn from those who are greater than us whether this is kosher or not. And the Gemara continues, what is it that needs to be looked into in terms of this halacha? If you're going to say, because in this case, what we have over here is words, it's just instructions, and there's a doubt, when you have words, when it's not something of substance, it's that something that can be given over to a shliach, or it cannot be given over to a shliach. But Shmuel said that Rebbe said, halacha Rabbi Yossi. The halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, who says that words cannot be given over to a shliach. And so the Gemara instead says, rather, to Shmuel, the following is what was the question to him. Hai ksovu, when he says over here, ksovu, when he tells them to write the get, ichsav yodon ichsav haget. What's he referring to? Is he referring to their handwriting? Meaning to say, is he only referring to the signatures, and therefore they would be able to appoint a scribe to write the get? Or maybe he's talking about the actual writing of the get, and the husband means to say that they themselves have to write the get. And Rashi explains, you could say that instructions or words can be given over to a shliach, and therefore there's no problem if they go ahead and tell a sofer to write the get instead of themselves writing it. The question over here is, if you have words, if you have instructions that are given over to one shliach, can he give those instructions over to another shliach? And so over here the idea is the husband told them, he told the two individuals to write and give the get to my wife. The instruction to write the get is words, and on the one hand you could say mili mimser l'shliach, they're allowed to give those instructions over to another shliach, to a sofer. Ilo mimser, maybe we say no, the mili cannot be given over. Upasul, therefore would be disqualified. Da'acha mili bi'alma masrlu, because here he just gave them words. The einon chosrin v'nimsaron l'sofer, they can't be given over. Those instructions can't be given over to the scribe. V'lo dami l'moser get l'shlucho. Now Rashi says it's not similar to giving over a document, a get to a shliach. There you have something of substance, so we can go and give it to another shliach, but here it's just an instruction, maybe it's not able to be given over. And Rashi continues, halacha Rabbi Yossi de Masnisin. The halacha is like Rabbi Yossi of our Mishnah, again, that mili lo mimsaran l'shliach. And so the Gemara instead says, Ela misaf galei ihai kisvu dekamar lahu. Rather, the question is, when the husband says to write the get, what is he referring to? Ichsav yad, and maybe he's referring to their handwriting, meaning chasimasan, meaning their signatures. Hu dekamar, that's what he's referring to. Varei chasvuhin, and they did sign the get, and a scribe is able to write it. Ochsav hagetu varei lo chasvu, maybe it's referring to the writing of the get, and therefore they themselves have to write it. If they give it over to a sofer, that would be a problem. And we will note over here that the Rabbi Yossi that the Gemara is referring to is the Rabbi Yossi of our Mishnah. That's the Rabbi Yossi that mentioned the Bezin Hagadol Sheb Yerushalayim, that they themselves have to write the get. And the Gemara is now explaining that Rabbi Yossi means to say, Mili lo mimsran l'shliach. And the Gemara continues, if this is the question of Shmuel, the question is whether the instruction is the writing or the signing, we should be able to answer that question from our Mishnah. Amar l'shnayim tenu get l'ishti, or l'shlosha kisvu get tenu l'ishti. It said in our Mishnah, if he tells two people, if he says to two people, give a get to my wife, or he says to three people, write a get and give it to my wife, so they themselves have to write it and give it. And so it sounds like it's saying in the Mishnah that the instruction is talking about the writing. It's not simply talking about the signing. And the Gemara answers to that, he gufa kami baile. No, the Mishnah itself is the question. The Mishnah can be interpreted in two ways as well. Ksovu ksav yodan hu ochsav hagetu. When it says ksovu, what does that mean? Is it referring to their handwriting, meaning their signatures, or is it referring to the writing of the get? But the Gemara continues, Pshita d'chsav hagetu. It's obvious that the Mishnah is referring to the writing of the actual get. To Katani Sefer, because it says at the end of the Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Yossi, again, Rabbi Yossi says, Nominu l'shliach afanu mekubalin, say to the shliach that we also have a tradition, Shafi lo amar lebezin hagadol sheb Yerushalayim, that even if he says to the bezin hagadol in Yerushalayim, to nu get l'ishti, give a get to my wife, she yilmedu v'yichtavu v'yitnu la, it says they have to learn and they have to write it and they have to give it to her. If you say that we're referring to the the writing of the actual get, that makes sense. They would have to learn how to write a get. But if you say we're talking about their handwriting, meaning their signatures, is there such a thing as a court that doesn't know how to sign? What would the Mishnah mean when it says they have to learn how to write the get? It must be referring to the writing of the get. It can't be referring to the fact that they have to learn how to sign a get. Everybody knows how to sign a get. And the Gemara says, no, yes, there is such a thing as a bezdin that doesn't know how to sign. Ika beidin acharata. You can have a new bezdin, and that bezdin doesn't know how to sign, and that could be what the Mishnah means. But the Gemara continues, but if we hold that when it says ksovu in the Mishnah, it refers to their signatures, that's what we mean at the end of the Mishnah. Haksava get kosher, then that would imply that the writing of the get, if it's done by a scribe, it's kosher at the end of the Mishnah. But that can't be. V'amar Shmuel lama Rebbe. But Shmuel said that Rebbe said, Halacha Rebbe Yossi da'amar mili lo mimsran l'shliach. The halacha is like Rebbe Yossi, who says that mili lo mimsran l'shliach. So why would the writing of the get be kosher? And the Gemara continues, Amri, they answered, if we held that when it says ksovu, when the husband gives the instruction of ksovu, it's referring just to their signatures, so ksav get, so then when it comes to the writing of the get, nasa ka'omer imru, that's already not a simple case of mili, it's a case of omer imru. It's as if the husband said that you should appoint a scribe. Go tell a scribe to write it. Umod Rabbi Yossi ba'omer imru. Rabbi Yossi would admit by a case of omer imru that then we would say the instruction is allowed to be given over to a shliach. And Rashi explains, if we hold that ksovu means just the signatures, haksav get, imamru l'sofer v'chasav kosher bitmiya. So when it comes to the writing of the get, if this bezdin tells a sofer to write it, that would be kosher. That can't be the case. V'amar Shmuel halacha Rabbi Yossi, but Shmuel said the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, the masnisin of our Mishnah. V'kevon departed Shmuel time of the Rabbi Yossi mishum demili lo mimsron l'shliach. Now the point over here is, since Shmuel explained the reason of Rabbi Yossi as we said above, Rabbi Yossi holds the reasoning is that mili lo mimsron l'shliach, an instruction can't be given over to a shliachu. So heich kosher hamilin. So how would it be kosher over here? Still, the bezdin is giving an instruction over to another shliach, to a scribe, to write the get. And the Gemara answers to that, Umeshani, and we answer, you have a svira law, and upshita lan dechsovu to ka'amar, lo havel chsav yad. And if it was obvious to us that when the husband says ksovu, that's referring just to their signatures, ikol ameimar dechsav haget midelo kapit aleh, so we could say that when it comes to the writing of the get, from the fact that he didn't mention anything about it, he wasn't makbid about it, nasa ka'omer imru l'sofer v'yichtav, that's as if the husband explicitly said, go tell a scribe to write it. He didn't simply leave it to the bezdin, he instructed the bezdin to find the scribe and write the get. Right now we think Rabbi Yossi would admit, even though mili lo mimsar l'shliach, but by omer imru it would be effective. But the Gemara continues, Umi moder Rabbi Yossi ba'omer imru. Does Rabbi Yossi really admit by a case of omer imru? Again, if the husband instructs a shliach to tell a scribe to write the get, that is kosher. V'tanan, but we learned in the Mishnah, ksav sofer v'eid kosher. If you have the writing of the scribe and the signature of one aid, that is going to be kosher. V'yam Rabbi Yirmiyah chesam sofer shaninu. And Rabbi Yirmiyah said on that Mishnah that we're not talking simply about the writing of the get there, but we're talking about the signature of the scribe on the get. V'yam Rav Chisda, and Rav Chisda said on that Mishnah, masnis and money Rabbi Yossi. Who's the author of this Mishnah? It's Rabbi Yossi. Da'amar mili lo mimsron l'shliach. It's Rabbi Yossi's opinion that an instruction cannot be given over to a shliach. And Rashi explains, Umi modev v'hanon tanan kasav sofer saget v'chosam eid acher kosher. We learned in a Mishnah, let's say the sofer writes the get, so he's like one aid, and then there's one aid that's signed on the get, so that's kosher. V'yam Rabbi Yirmiyah chesam sofer shaninu. And Rabbi Yirmiyah said, when we're talking about the scribe writing the get, we're really talking about the signature of the scribe on the get. Hai ksav sofer de katani chasam, who we're talking about the signature of the scribe. Shem chasam hasofer be'eid ve'eid acharimo kosher. The point is, if the scribe signs as one of the witnesses, and then you have another witness, that's going to be kosher, like having two witnesses. And Rav Chisda said on that, masnisin de machsher chasim hasofer beget Rabbi Yossi. Rav Chisda made a comment on the Mishnah that who is the author of our Mishnah that says that a scribe is allowed to sign the get? That's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. The same Rabbi Yossi we quoted earlier, the Amar Mili lo mimsron l'shliach, who says that an instruction cannot be given over to another shliach. Why is this associated with Rabbi Yossi? Rashi explains, Hilkach, therefore, ein adam chosim beget elim kein shama mipi atzmo. A person can't sign again unless he has a direct instruction from the husband. That's the idea of Mili lo mimsron l'shliach. If a shliach tells somebody to sign a get, that person cannot give the instruction over to another person to sign the get. Therefore, mili lo mimsar l'shliach, everyone who's signing heard directly from the husband. Lefi she'ein hashliach rashoy lomer la'edim Chisma beget ploni. A shliach, for example, can't tell Adam to sign mili lo mimzrin l'shliach. Umishum hachi lekal mechash hacha shema habal lo tziva sheyachsum. That's why over here the signature of the scribe is going to be okay. It's not going to be a problem. There is no concern that maybe the husband didn't really instruct him to sign. Ella, rather, what might have happened was l'shlucho tziva sheyomer l'sofer zelichtov v'lacherim lachsum. The husband instructed his shliach to tell a sofer, to tell a scribe to write the get, but to tell others to sign the get. V'ashliach chasha shem yisbayish hasofer, and the shliach was concerned maybe the sofer would be embarrassed because he's not being trusted to sign. Lomarin makavlin also aid, as if they're not accepting the sofer to be an aid. And then we have this concern that maybe since the shliach had this concern, tziva l'sofer lachtom, he's the one that instructed the scribe to sign, and really the husband didn't want the scribe to sign, and maybe that should have been a concern, but that's not a concern over here. The reason why the scribe of the sofer is considered kosher is because the halacha is mili lo mimzrin l'shliach. There is no person, there is no intermediary who's giving the instruction of who should sign, and therefore we know that everyone who signed on the get received a direct instruction from the husband. That's what Rav Chisda meant when he said this Mishnah, which allows for the signature of the scribe, is following Rabbi Yossi. And so now Rashi explains, from the fact that Rav Chisda said our Mishnah is Rabbi Yossi because we don't have any concern of an intermediary, because if there would be an intermediary over here, we would have a concern about the signature of the sofer. So from here we see Deva Omer Imru Nami Palag Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi, when he says Mili Lo Mimsron L'Shliach, he says that by Omer Imru as well, because if by Omer Imru he admitted that you can have an intermediary in that fashion, we still would have a problem over here. The Salgadait and Modi Bey, because if we think that Rabbi Yossi admits by Omer Imru that you can have an intermediary, so then Hechi Machshir Chasima Sofer Begets. How could we allow the signature of a scribe by a get? Nafik Mina Churba V'chulu. So then you are going to have a problem with Gittin, as the Gemara now says. V'Salgadait Zach Modi Rabbi Yossi B'Omer Imru. If you think that Rabbi Yossi admits by a case of Omer Imru, Nafik Mina Churba, so then you are going to have a destructive situation over here. The Zimnin Do Amar Luhu L'Shnayim, because sometimes the husband will say to two people, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Zayin Amud Aleph.